It's somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. You're awake. You weren't planning to be awake, but here you are, and the mind, which was perfectly quiet 6 hours ago, is now running at full speed on something that hasn't happened yet. A conversation you might need to have, a decision you haven't made, something you said 3 days ago that you can't stop replaying, some version of the future in which things go wrong. The strange thing is, right now, in this exact moment, you are fine. You are lying in a bed. Nothing is on fire. And yet the mind is in a state of emergency about a scenario that exists entirely within itself. If you have ever been in that room at that hour, you already know something that most advice doesn't quite address. Understanding anxiety is not the same as being free from it. 3 of the greatest philosophical traditions in history, Stoicism, Buddhism, and Taoism, each looked directly at this experience. And each of them found something different underneath it. Not the same answer in different packaging. 3 genuinely distinct ways of seeing what the mind is doing when anxiety takes over. Together, they form a map that is harder to draw than most modern accounts suggest, and more useful. Modern anxiety care offers real help, therapy, practical tools, lifestyle changes, and, when appropriate, medication can make a meaningful difference. That is not what this episode is arguing against. But ancient philosophy asks a slightly different question. Not only, how do we reduce this feeling, but what is the mind doing when anxiety takes hold? What relationship to uncertainty, pain, and the unknown makes the spiral grow? Stoicism, Buddhism, and Taoism each approach that question from a very different direction. The Stoics worked in the Greek and Roman world, from around the 3rd century BCE through the 2nd century CE. The Buddhist philosophical tradition emerged from ancient India, associated with the teachings of the Buddha, whose life is generally placed around the 5th century BCE, though the precise dates remain debated by scholars. And the Taoist tradition traces its roots to ancient China, built around a text, the Tao Te Ching, traditionally attributed to a sage called Laozi, though both the author's historical identity and the text's origins are uncertain. 3 very different cultural worlds, 3 very different frameworks, and 3 diagnoses of anxiety that, placed side by side, say something none of them could say alone. We start with a man who was powerful, burdened, and honest enough to write down how often his own mind needed correcting. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 CE. He commanded the largest military force in the Western world. He administered an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. He was, by any external measure, one of the most powerful men alive. And he kept a private journal filled with reminders to himself about how not to let his own mind ruin him. What we now call the Meditations was written as private philosophical exercises, not as a public book. An early Byzantine reference calls it ta eis hauton, writings to himself. It was never published in his lifetime. It was not addressed to posterity. It was a man talking to himself, trying to remember what he believed on the days when remembering was hard. What the repetition inside that journal tells us is important. He returns to the same ideas again and again, the same corrections, the same reminders, the same arguments against his own tendencies. This is not the record of a man who has solved his inner life. This is the record of a man who has to keep working at it. In Book 4, he writes, "People try to get away from it all, to the country, to the beach, to the mountains. You always wish that you could too, which is idiotic. You can get away from it anytime you like, by going within. Nowhere you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions, than your own soul. That is not the writing of a man in serene command of his inner state. That is a man who understands the pull of escape, who has felt it himself, and who keeps having to remind himself where the actual shelter is. The Stoic diagnosis of anxiety begins with a distinction the school considered foundational: the event and the judgment about the event. These are not the same thing. The event is what happened, or what might happen. The judgment is the meaning the mind assigns to it, the threat it identifies, the story it builds, the catastrophe it assembles from available fragments about a future that has not yet arrived. Anxiety, for the Stoics, is not caused directly by circumstances. It is often intensified by the judgment we attach to uncertainty, the mind's prediction that what may happen would be unbearable. And that prediction is not a fact. It is an interpretation. Marcus addresses this directly in Book 8. Don't let your imagination be crushed by life as a whole. Don't try to picture everything bad that could possibly happen. Stick with the situation at hand and ask, why is this so unbearable? Why can't I endure it? You'll be embarrassed to answer. This is not dismissiveness. It is a very precise surgical move. The anxious mind ranges across everything. The past it can't change, the futures it can't see, the worst-case scenarios it constructs, with impressive detail and no evidence. The Stoic practice is to return the mind to the only thing that is real: this moment, this specific situation, this actual fact on the ground, and then to ask, honestly, in this moment, what is actually unbearable? Not what might become unbearable, not what was hard before or might be hard tomorrow. What, right now, is genuinely beyond endurance. In most cases, when the question is asked with real honesty, the answer surprises you. The unbearable thing is in the imagination. And the imagination is, in the Stoic framework, within your sphere of influence, not perfectly controllable, not solved by a single decision, but trainable, workable, and never fully beyond your reach. This was one way of approaching anxiety. But on the other side of the world, a different tradition was examining a different thread. The Buddhist philosophical tradition does not offer a single, unified theory of anxiety as such, but within its analysis of how suffering is generated, there are teachings that speak directly to what the anxious mind does, and why it is so hard to stop. The first of these is a concept from the Madhupindika Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 18, one of the early Buddhist discourses. The Pali word is papañca. It is usually translated as mental proliferation, the spinning out of the mind from one experience into an entire constructed world. But the sequence the sutta describes is worth tracing carefully, because it is more precise than simply one thought becomes a spiral. Contact gives rise to feeling. Feeling is perceived. Perception becomes thought. And what is thought about can proliferate. A small moment becomes an interpretation. The interpretation becomes a story. The story reaches backward into the past and forward into the future. And suddenly, the mind is not only responding to what happened, it is responding to an entire world it has constructed around what happened. Sometimes anxiety has an identifiable cause, a real uncertainty, a genuine risk, a difficult situation that requires navigating. Papañca can still attach to that. It takes the real concern and builds far beyond it. And sometimes it seems to find its own material, attaching itself to whatever thought is available, because the proliferation has its own momentum. The Buddhist insight is that once this process begins, even a small concern can become an entire mental world. This is why addressing only the content of anxiety, this specific worry, this particular fear, sometimes feels like cutting one head off a creature that grows two more, The content is not the source. The process is. The second teaching is one of the most useful images in any tradition for understanding anxious suffering. It appears in the Salatha Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya 36.6, the discourse on the arrow. The Buddha describes two arrows. The first arrow is the painful or difficult thing that happens, the loss, the uncertainty, the hard circumstance. This arrow, he says, is part of life. It cannot always be avoided. The second arrow is what the mind can add in response. The resistance, the despair, the desperate wishing that the first arrow hadn't landed. The self-criticism for struggling. The anxiety about the anxiety itself. Applying this image to anxiety specifically is an interpretation. The sutta speaks first of physical pain, but the image holds. There may be a real uncertainty, an upcoming conversation, a situation with no clear answer. That is the first arrow. Then there is the anguish the mind adds around it, the catastrophizing, the rehearsal of worst cases, the fear of the feeling itself. This is the second. The first arrow is real. The second is not always inevitable. That distinction does not mean that rumination and anxiety spirals are simple choices a person makes. Papañca happens automatically, often before there is any sense of deciding. The teaching is not one of blame. It is one of recognition. Once you can see the second arrow, once you recognize that some portion of the suffering you are in is something the mind is generating around the original difficulty, there is sometimes the possibility of not feeding it further. Beneath both of these teachings sits a broader Buddhist concept, anicca, impermanence. One way of understanding anxiety is that it is, in part, the mind's resistance to the fundamental uncertainty of the future. We want to know how things will go. We want stability in a situation that cannot offer it. And the Buddhist tradition suggests that this resistance, the craving for certainty in an impermanent world, is itself part of what keeps the spiral going. This is an interpretation of the tradition rather than a direct canonical claim, but it is one many Buddhist teachers have drawn. The Dhammapada puts the underlying relationship between craving and suffering plainly. From craving springs grief, from craving springs fear. For one who is wholly free from craving, there is no grief, whence then fear. Not freedom from all desire. Freedom from the compulsive grasping for things, including certainty, including safety, including a particular version of the future, that makes peace conditional on the world, cooperating exactly as required. The Tao Te Ching is not a treatise on anxiety. It does not name it, diagnose it, or prescribe a treatment for it. What it does, through image, paradox, and deliberate indirection, is describe a quality of relating to the world that is almost the exact opposite of what anxiety produces. And applied to the anxious mind, its images are remarkably precise. The text traditionally attributed to Laozi is built around the concept of the Tao, the underlying way of things, the current that moves through all of life. The practice the text describes is Wu Wei, non-forcing, non-striving. Not passivity, but action that is aligned with what is, rather than in combat with it. Chapter 8 describes the model this way. The supreme good is like water, which nourishes all things without trying to. It is content with the low places that people disdain. Thus, it is like the Tao. Water does not force, it yields, and in yielding, it finds its path. It flows around obstacles rather than through them. It settles into the lowest places, and given enough time, it shapes mountains. Applied to anxiety, the image suggests something specific. Some forms of anxious suffering feel like forcing certainty from an uncertain future, forcing clarity before it is available, demanding that the mind produce an answer it does not yet have. The harder you force, the more turbulent everything becomes. Chapter 76 makes the contrast between force and yield in human terms. A man is born gentle and weak. At his death, he is hard and stiff. Green plants are tender and filled with sap. At their death, they are withered and dry. Therefore, the stiff and unbending is the disciple of death. The gentle and yielding is the disciple of life. Rigidity in the body, in the mind, in the demand that things be resolved before they are ready, moves in the direction of brittleness. The flexible thing survives. The thing that insists on being unmoved breaks. Chapter 15 gives the quietest and most useful image in the tradition for this. Who can wait quietly while the mud settles? Who can remain still until the moment of action? Muddy water cannot be cleared by stirring it. Stirring is exactly what keeps it muddy. The mud settles on its own, but only if the agitation stops, only if the water is allowed to find its own stillness. The Tao Te Ching does not tell us this is what anxiety is, but as an image of what anxious forcing does, it lands with unusual precision. The mind that demands immediate clarity, that cannot tolerate not knowing, that tries to think its way through the spiral faster and harder, that mind is stirring muddy water and wondering why it cannot see the bottom. The Taoist suggestion is not helplessness. It is a different kind of discipline, restraint. The discipline of not adding force when force is making things worse, of allowing the settling to happen rather than demanding it happen now. This sounds simple. It is not. It requires tolerating the discomfort of uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. And in an anxious state, that is one of the hardest things to do. Three traditions looked closely at what happens when the mind gets trapped in fear, uncertainty, and anticipation. They do not give the same answer in different clothing. The Stoics focused on judgment, the interpretations the mind attaches to uncertain events, which intensify anxiety beyond what the situation alone would produce. Buddhist teachings examined proliferation, the process by which one perception can be elaborated through feeling and thought into an entire constructed world of suffering, and the additional anguish the mind adds around difficulty that was already real. Taoist texts offered images of forcing, yielding, and clarity, the observation that demanding resolution from an unresolved situation often makes the resolution harder to find. Put side by side, they do not form a cure for anxiety, but they do offer three different ways of understanding what the mind may be doing when anxiety arrives. And there is something all three share underneath the different frameworks. None of them locate anxiety primarily in the circumstances. The difficult circumstance, the uncertain future, the thing that cannot yet be resolved. These are real. But the anxiety is built from that material by a mind that is doing something with it, judging it, spinning it, forcing it. And that process, in different ways, to different degrees, is something that can be worked with, not eliminated, not solved once and finished, worked with as a continuing practice. The shift that all three traditions point toward is not become someone who no longer feels anxious. It is become someone who is not entirely controlled by anxiety when it arrives. These are different goals. The first may not be possible, and pursuing it can become its own source of pressure. The second is genuinely achievable, slowly, through practice, with regular failure and a return to beginning. The Stoic version of this shift is to notice when the mind is ranging over the entire imagined future and bring it back to the specific present fact. Not because the future is irrelevant, but because the catastrophe being constructed is not the future. It is a story about the future, told in the present, by a mind that is treating it as if it were already real. The Buddhist version is to notice when the second arrow has been picked up, when the suffering has a layer of additional suffering added around it, the anxiety about the anxiety, the self-criticism for struggling, the fear of the feeling itself, and to practice in those moments, not adding more. The Taoist version is to notice when force is being applied, where force is making things worse, and to allow, instead of demanding, to sit with the mud, rather than stir it, to trust that some forms of clarity arrive not when we demand them, but when we stop preventing them. In all three cases, the movement is the same direction, from a mind at war with what it cannot resolve, toward a mind that can be present with uncertainty without being destroyed by it. This is harder than most advice makes it sound. It is also more durable. The practice these traditions describe is not a philosophy you understand once and then have. It is something you return to in real time, in the moments when the spiral has already started. Here is the simplest version of that return. The next time the anxious loop begins, the mind ranging over what could go wrong, rehearsing conversations that haven't happened, building futures that may never arrive, pause and ask one question. Is this the first arrow or the second? Is this the actual difficulty, the real uncertainty, the genuine concern, the thing that is actually in front of you and requires something from you? Or is this the anguish the mind has built around it? The catastrophizing, the rumination, the fear of the feeling itself. If it is the first arrow, it is real. Bring the Stoic move. What specifically in this present situation is actually unbearable? Often the honest answer is nothing yet. If it is the second arrow, you are not broken for holding it. The mind picks it up automatically. But once you can see it, there is sometimes the possibility of not tightening your grip on it further. And if the mind will not settle with either of those, if the proliferation continues regardless, try the Taoist response. Stop adding force. Stop demanding the clarity that isn't here yet. Sit with the mud, without stirring, and allow whatever stillness is available to begin. Marcus Aurelius kept writing the same reminders to himself because wisdom was something he repeatedly had to return to, not something he possessed. The Buddha spent decades teaching that freedom from suffering required practice, not merely understanding. And in the legend surrounding Laozi, the sage leaves behind a brief book of 81 chapters before disappearing beyond the frontier, leaving no further instructions, just the images and the invitation to sit with them. None of these traditions promises that anxiety will not return. What they offer is a different relationship with it, less judgment, less proliferation, less forcing, and the possibility that a mind working with those three things over time becomes slightly harder to crush. One note before you go. If anxiety is significantly affecting your daily life, these traditions are a meaningful companion to care, not a substitute for it. A conversation with a doctor or therapist is not a failure of philosophy. It is a different kind of wisdom. If this episode shifted something, if one of these three images named something you've been living with, share it with someone who's been trying to think their way out of the spiral. They'll know immediately why thinking harder isn't the answer. Next time, what does it actually look like to practice any of this? Because the gap between knowing a teaching and feeling it is real, and the philosophers had something specific to say about that gap too. Subscribe if you want to be there for that.